hey, I want more empowered teams. It's your fault because you are not giving them the context of empower.
You need to build products that customers love and work for the business.
We need direction because if not, teams are working towards optimizing too many different things that at the end is a little bit of improvement in each direction. When you have a solid strategy and solid roadmap, OKRs are almost done by themselves. Depending on the maturity of the product, you can set longer or shorter cycles. So the newer the product, the shorter the strategy cycle.
Nobody has time. We all make time. And then the question is, what do we prioritize?
The leaders of the organization, even the product leader or some higher up leadership, did not realize that they need to change. We are already doing Agile, but we are a feature factory and just shipping what management told us to build. I think it's super, super mega important to have a strategy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next episode of Agile Inside Conversation. Today, I'm hosting Nacho Bassino, who I met at a conference a few months ago, and he was introduced to me through a mutual friend, Tim Klein. Thank you, Tim, at this point in time. And Nacho and I will be speaking about product strategy, product direction, the book that he published, I think, about a year ago. But before we jump into that conversation, I'd like to hand over the stage to Nacho to introduce himself. Nacho, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really glad to have this conversation today. I'm basically a product leader who has been doing product for over almost 20 years now. I started as a software engineer, then moved to product. Luckily, I got good mentors who helped me grow in my career. And I've been leading product teams in different companies, in different industries like telco, gaming, travel. And I grew in the career ladder. And I become CPO of a company called Beste, a travel company in Mexico. I'm originally from Argentina. And then I moved to Europe, to Barcelona, where I'm currently living. But I will say that I have kind of two careers. That's my kind of more company ladder or company career. And then on the side, almost 8 years ago, I started trying to share everything I know, everything I learned about product. So I've been writing a lot. I did some training courses in some universities. I created some podcasts. And as I said, that led eventually to me writing a book about product strategy, which was a topic that I was really passionate about. And I felt that there was some gaps in the content we have available, which eventually also led to me using this all expertise and all the time I have built this knowledge content or things I want to share to help more companies and more teams become excellent at product management, which is actually what I'm really passionate about, helping more teams become high-performing product teams.
Yeah, this is cool. So you're also one of those people who has been there, done that, and now, after many years of experiencing yourself, like basically falling over every trap that's out there, you're coaching organizations and teams, you're supporting them to not go down through the same mistakes and learn a bit about how to do product actually in a better way. And I assume, Nacho, you mentioned it earlier, you've worked in many industries. Your work is not only software specific. You've probably also, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've probably also worked on some more tangible products out there. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I will say that always my angle has been more on the software side, but I have a few experiences. Like, for example, travel. I work in a company that had a destination management company, which is, getting passengers from one place to the other, and you need to manage vans and things like that. So there's a lot of the logistics aspect of it, which it's related to that. And also, for example, in the gaming space, we did some of the kind of the dice gaming also as well. So there's kind of different angles than just websites, which is also very interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've also had the luxury of taking a lot of the knowledge that I gained in the software field into other fields, like such as medical devices, automotives, and all. And the truth is, I mean, most of the principles, right? If we really stay on the principle level, are applicable. They're applicable anywhere, right? But that's maybe a conversation for later or another point in time. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, I want to use this conversation with you to speak about the book that you've written. And your book is titled Product Direction. Now, before I ask you to give us a brief summary of that book without spoiling anything, why did you decide to write that book? Because there's so many business books out there, and I think every year several thousand new business books are being written. but you must have felt the need to write something. If I remember correctly, you yourself are a vivid reader, so you know what's out there. Now, what was your motivation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly the point. At some point in time, I felt that I have read every good book on strategy that is out there, because there are many great books like Roger Martin work, or Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, or Blue Ocean Strategy, and things like that. So there are great books out there. But I felt that, especially when I was trying to implement product strategy, or when I was asked advice about product strategy, I felt that we lacked this practical implementation aspect of it. Mm-hmm. So what I try to cover is this gap between, okay, this is how the thinking of strategy you need to have, but this is how you actually put it down to earth for product work. For example, if we compare with Roger Martin is more business oriented, so he has good questions and good frameworks, but then for product work, there are some differences, and that's what I'm trying to focus my work on, and that's the pain or problem I was trying to solve.
Yeah. Now, looking at specifically what you mentioned about Roger, my favorite framework from Roger, and I was very lucky to interview him several times about his latest book, A New Way to Think. What I use a lot as a thinking tool for myself is where to play and how to win. And whenever I work with products and products that we built within our own company, I think this is applicable. But I can't get the point that you mentioned, right? If you want to take it to one level deeper, let's call it this way, there probably is a need for other things. Is that how you thought about this?
Exactly. If you think about, especially about the how to win part of it, there are aspects that are kind of on the business side. So like, for example, in what channels you will market or things like that. But then on the product side, you need to find a compelling value proposition inside your product that can be, or said in a way, what Roger Martin did was great, but was great directionally speaking. When you need to put it down to earth, there are some gaps that are tricky to fill.
Yeah, okay. And we'll explore more of that. Now, before we jumped into this conversation, of course, we had like pre-conversation, and you shared with me that you called it product direction because then direction fits really well with discovery and then with delivery. Obviously, this seems like a sequential process, but you and I both agree nothing in product or in innovation is sequential. But initially, you need some kind of direction. And my assumption is, and correct me again if I'm wrong, that you are or you're addressing primarily product leaders, people that are ultimately responsible for the product managers that then build the products. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I think that maybe even if we refer to how Marty Kagan phrased it now, is that it's the leader's responsibility to find these levers or these problems to solve that can really make a difference. Yes. So this is primary target for product leaders. Of course, senior product people are trying to be more strategic and trying to climb the ladder. So I think that they will find value in the book as well. And, all product work is related. So knowing more about how we do strategy is good at all levels. But primarily the implementation of the things I propose in the book is up to the product leader usually.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's dive into the book itself. If you look at your book and you already made some comparisons to existing or other strategy books, which are mainly about business strategy, like what is the main theme that goes through the book? Like what would be a few of the key takeaways, again, without spoiling too much, that people should take away from your book?
That's a good question. So I will split this into two. The first part is that the main thing of the book is making it practical. So if you are coming to say, hey, how I will understand my customer and find the right levers, the thing I'm trying to do is to give you tools to actually go do that. So I go from strategy, and it's called direction because it covers strategy, road mapping, and OKRs. So I'm trying to make it practical for you to come up with the strategy, have tools to define those critical things that the strategy needs to cover, and then connect them to the execution through roadmaps and OKRs. So basically my message there, so the takeaway there is that there is a way to connect all these things. And when you do it properly, like I'm collecting more frameworks, but if you think about Martin Erickson decision stack, there is a way to logically connect these decisions that makes your life easier. For example, I have seen product leaders many times go crazy each quarter on deciding OKRs because they think that they need to cover all options. When you have a solid strategy and solid roadmap, OKRs are almost done by themselves. So this is the anti-patterns I'm trying to fix. And the second big takeaway, I think that there is, so that first takeaway is practical and connected. The second big takeaway is that even though you may have different ways to implement it, the key theme that you need to keep in mind is that you need to uncover the opportunities and select the best opportunities, which is a topic that goes across many product phases. So, for example, in discovery, you will actually be working with opportunities as well. But these are kind of how you find the levers that will connect all the things that you will need to work on.
Yeah. Now, in your book, and maybe that's then also one of the key differences to the book that Petra Villa wrote, you're not specifically talking about how a product leader would be enabling product managers, right? You're covering a completely different aspect of product leadership.
Absolutely. I think that for one thing I would say is that Petra's books is awesome, so every product leader should read it. And on the other side, yes, I mean there is the responsibility of the product leader of coaching and developing their people, and there is the responsibility of the product leader to leading with context. And in this leading with context, there is a very specific chapter which is how you come up with the direction for your teams, and that's the topic I'm trying to cover.
Yeah, no, I like this point, and I also like that you called it direction, because I would assume, and maybe you put some thought into this, if you had called it product strategy, people might have looked at it the way that a lot of people look at traditional strategy, which again, both you and I know that the perspective on traditional strategy, none of the big strategy gurus shares that. I mean, Roger, I was fortunate to talk to him. He's like very agile in his mind. And strategy is basically that star, that North Star, and then we are very flexible on the details, as Jeff Bezos puts it out there. But I could assume or imagine that if you would have called your book strategy, people would have fallen into that trap. Now with direction, it looks more like a compass. And actually on your book cover, you have a compass. If you have the book, you can show it. Yeah,
that's it. That's
absolutely.
A compass.
I like the fact. I like that. Now, you mentioned there's two things, right? Making it practical. The other is uncovering the opportunities, and both of them are ultimately leading with context for a product leader with their product managers. Now, if you look at the organizations that you've worked at, my guess is that a lot of the topics that you emphasized in the book are based on lacks that you have observed in those organizations. And my question would be, A, is that correct? And B, why do you think so many organizations lack to either have product leaders in the first place, and or the product leaders not knowing the stuff that you are trying to cover in your book, and also Petra trying to cover in her book from a different angle?
Yeah, I love that, how you put it. I would say that actually the way I wrote the book is almost the opposite. It's trying to see what good leaders were doing and trying to distill that into an applicable framework. So actually, as a follow-up of the book, I created a podcast series in which I interview product leaders to actually get real life experience on how people is doing the strategy. And you can see the patterns from the books that are kind of arising, are coming up again and again, even though with different tools, different contexts, and different things, the pattern of how you build strategy is quite similar. And so to the second question, and on what are those gaps, or how this lack of a strategy happens, because that's also a good point. I remember that when Marty Kagan 2 years ago was about to publish Empowered, one of the things he said in a keynote or an article was that remarkably, most of the organizations he met didn't even have a product strategy. It's not that there was a bad product strategy; it was inexistent at all. So going back to your second question, I think that there is, or I actually wrote about this in the book, the reason in the book, but there are these, the shops to be done forces diagram, in which you have things that push you to get a new model and things that kind of prevent you or make friction to adopt new things. I think that leaders have two fundamental problems. The first one is that they are constantly putting down fires. So there's time management issue. And then for that, you can talk to Petra, which is great. But then the second one, most important, is that strategy is so ill-defined, not only from a conceptual point of view, but also from who has to do it and how you actually do it and how good strategy looks like, that I think that was the real problem I was trying to address. So let's put it out there, let's make product leaders accountable, and let's try to show them, if they haven't done it before, how it might be done, even though, of course, as any book with a framework, it will need to be adapted to the reality of that leader.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting the point that you brought up about putting out fires. I was just running a workshop this morning for a group of 16 leaders at one of my most important clients. And we were talking about like 3 different leadership styles: expert, achiever, catalyst. And when they were going through the catalyst, like, this sounds amazing, but who has time to lead like this, right? Like, and in that interview, they were talking about like a 2-day offsite and trying to get everyone on board and all. Like, in my day life, I don't have the time. And of course, whenever someone says I don't have the time, I tell them, I mean, you make time. Nobody has time. We all make time. And then the question is, what do we prioritize? Right? Exactly. If we prioritize creating alignment because we know down the road it will be much more effective and efficient, yeah, then we make the time for this alignment early on. But raising that awareness, I think, is one, and then helping them implement it in their daily lives on a day-to-day basis. That's the second thing. That's where it becomes so difficult. I mean, it's the same with exercise. We all know exercising and eating well is important, but then you need to make the time, make the effort and all of that. Now, Nacho, when you work with these leaders, and I think for many of them, like, going through your book is eye-opening, and then they're like, okay, Nacho, now let's help us, like, let's do this, right? How do you start?
Yeah. So the other thing I created recently is a sort of thinking about the maturity stage of product teams and product organizations. And so maybe making it more concrete, to answer your question, I usually try to figure out at what maturity stage they are. Because if you think of an empowered team that already has, their kind of the outcomes they are, and they are maybe mostly needing to kind of group the topics they have in their head, that's a completely different story from a team that is, we are all barely doing Agile, but we are a feature factory and just shipping what management told us to build. So these different stages can change your approach. But usually, to make it a bit simpler, the answer, the key point is really focusing on gathering these opportunities. So most of the teams I see that are maybe too focused on solutions and discussing solutions, either with stakeholders or trying to prioritize solution with some sort of prioritization dashboard or whatever. And the thing to build strategy, you need to go one higher level than that. So what I told them to do is to start reverse engineering. So you are deciding this priority because you are trying to tackle an opportunity that solves a problem that has potentially a good lever to achieve something greater in the future. So by doing this reverse engineering, and we do this for n items in the backlog, so let's say 10 items, you start to see the patterns. So, hey, these opportunities are the ones that kind of these solutions are mapping to. And you start seeing, hey, let's assess these opportunities. Which one is high priority? Which one has a higher potential for being a good lever to achieve our strategic outcomes? And this reverse engineering helps them kind of start realizing, okay, the opportunity space that we have has these gaps or these things that we shouldn't be pursuing because they shouldn't be a priority.
Yeah. If you hadn't mentioned that you started your career as a software engineer, I would now know that you started as a software engineer. You mentioned like reverse engineering so many times, but jokes aside, I think this is a really good way to do this, because what I could also imagine, like, they have a bunch of items in their backlog. They do this reverse engineering exercise that you just mentioned. They realize that they're addressing like hundreds of different opportunities. They're like, oh man, we don't have any direction. We should have Absolutely. A direction, because that is the reason that makes it so hard for all of our product managers, product owners, whatever you want to call them, to prioritize their backlog, because the direction is completely lacking, right? And especially if you look at a product being built by multiple teams and multiple of those product managers making individual prioritization decisions. And that's what I see all the time. So running this reverse engineering exercise, I can imagine being very, very valuable.
Yeah, I mean, it's on one hand it's easy to do because there is the analysis paralysis. Hey, let's find opportunities. So where we start. So in this way, you unblock this mental gap on how we start. And the other thing, as you said, is very revealing, because you may know that you are not having any direction, but you start seeing, hey, these are the many problems that we are solving, and some of those problems doesn't make any sense. It's very eye-opening in terms of what we can do next.
Yeah. And I mean, even if they all make sense, you would be able to then rank them against each other. And probably they realize that they can't work on all of them at the same time. So there's a lot of these elements that suddenly become transparent to the people, that they have to address things differently. Now, I wanted to ask a question. Okay, so you run this reverse engineering, you realize the opportunities. My assumption is sometimes people do this reverse engineering and they realize that whatever they have in their backlog is not connected to any real business opportunity. Does that happen?
So there are two typical patterns. The first one is that, hey, we are solving this because at some point we thought it was a good idea, never do a proper, no one did a proper assessment of the size of the opportunity. The opportunity is not very valuable. That's the easy part. I think the most conflictive part, and going back to what you were saying before about the kind of the different sides, is that there are many opportunities that make sense, but are completely going in different directions. So for let's use the most typical example. You have some efforts that are trying to grow the customer base, or we are trying to do this to attract more customers, and we are trying to do this to be more efficient and reduce our operating costs. Depending on the stage of the company, I mean, both are very valuable. And if you look at the EBITDA, or if you use the ROI prioritization, any method, both may be equally valuable. But depending on the stage in the company, depending on the bets the leaders want to make, one may be quite more important than the other. So those are the things that are very important to discern when doing this exercise.
Yeah. No, I can see that. I can absolutely see that. Now, you run this exercise and they understand that they need direction. What's next?
So as I was saying before, what you see there, start to see the opportunity map, or the opportunity space, where you want to, whatever tool you want to use it. I usually, actually, maybe referring to other product coaches, I usually use the opportunity solution tree by Teresa Torres. Like, it's a very, very easy to use tool, and very kind of eye-opening in itself. So you start mapping these opportunities to the outcomes, and then you start seeing if those outcomes are relevant or not. So the things that they usually see is that there are gaps on their understanding. There are, for example, places in which they don't have enough opportunities, or places in which they want to invest more, but they don't have the opportunity. So when you jump directly to the solutions, you would say, hey, this is the solution I find, and I would start building it. When you are forced to see the opportunities that you need to capture, that's a good trigger for, okay, what type of research we need to do, what type of analysis we need to do on the market, or whatever. So this triggers what I call the insights phase, which is, to me, the first phase on the strategy, which is trying to collect all these pieces of information in an organized way. I usually say that you need to end up with a wall full of insights that, of course, have some links or some mapping to each other to see what space is more relevant to you. So yeah, that's the first phase. And the second phase, maybe that making the jump, is what I call the selection phase, in which you need to pursue which are the most important ones. And going back to what I was referring before, you are not deciding based on ROI calculations. When you are making strategic decisions, you need to look at what positioning you want to make in the market. So the how to win. So how am I going to be better than competitors in this space for this particular customers in this particular way, so they choose me over others? And this is a very different story than selecting on matrix or ROI calculation. Actually, the story I love, if I can share, is the story from a very early Netflix. That the story is in the book That Will Never Work, which is by Ralph. I can't remember the author now, but it's the early founder of Netflix. And what he said is that they were doing both selling DVDs and renting DVDs. And then Amazon approached, also very early Amazon, only selling books and trying to expand. And they were trying to acquire Netflix. Of course, it didn't never happen. But when the founders of Netflix walked out of that room, they understood that they will never be able to compete with Amazon in selling DVDs. So that they really need to double down in the renting DVDs, which was their kind of the place or the positioning that they can build and sustain and maintain against other competitors and really win on that market. So the corollary of the story is that when they made the decision, most of the revenues were coming from selling DVDs. So that's why it's not an ROI calculation. It's more of positioning and how to win sort of question.
Yeah. No, I love the fact that you brought this up. And yes, feel free to share any stories that you have, because these stories make it tangible. And at least for me, when I hear a story, I remember the things much easier. Now, talking about this positioning piece, Nacho, I fully agree with you. I hate it when I see teams trying to make backlog prioritization based on ROI calculations or whatever other kind of metric, they weighted shortest job first, whatever, right? I get mad at this because all of it is just thin air, right? Everybody can come up with, oh, this is going to be the return. But positioning, it doesn't have that many numbers. But around positioning, there is a logic, right? And there are decisions associated with this. Now, when I think about this, if I talk about product positioning, it needs to be consistent with your business positioning. So let's say you're LVMH, right? Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, and you're building a product. You can't go into discount because it's not consistent with your business positioning. And the reason I bring this up is when we want a product leader, and that's my understanding now, to make this positioning decision, they need to be aware of the overall business positioning, business strategy, and probably also play a role in the creation of such. Is that correct?
That is completely correct. So let me start with the positive example. So there are companies that have a strong business strategy, and the product leader, as you said, probably needs to fit in the strategy, collaborate in the definition. Hey, there are things that our product cannot do, so we cannot pursue this path with a dollar. But then once that strategy is kind of defined, the product leader needs to define, and of course, they will collaborate with the other leaders in the organization to define the product strategy that will fit into it. And I have one kind of one example that maybe it's a bit visual. I work for a travel company in Mexico called Best Day, which is kind of largest travel company in the country at the moment, and we were competing with other travel companies like Expedia, Booking, you name it. But we have a very particular business strategy, which was we were strong and we want to get stronger in the Caribbean. So we want to, for example, have the best prices available. So we have a supply team that, different from Booking, which is all over the world, was very focused and very connected to the hotels in the Caribbean, just to use a simple example. So you have this supply strategy, you have a marketing strategy, you have a B2B strategy and different things. And the product side, it's quite different, the things you do in the product to be great at the Caribbean that, for example, to be Booking and be great worldwide or average worldwide. Because, for example, showing an average hotel is quite different than showing these all-inclusive hotels in the Caribbean. So you need to have a place to show all the amenities, the restaurants, and the things that the people decide why they want to stay in a particular hotel. So I'm not sure if this story makes sense, but what I'm saying is that the product strategy and focusing on the things we need to solve for this particular market, for this particular strength we want to build, are quite different, or would be different from Expedia, which is trying to solve for an average worldwide than the thing we did.
Yeah, so the product direction, to use your book's title, is of course informed by the business direction or the business strategy. Yeah. Now, let's go in there. If we talk about business strategy, I've had this conversation with Roger several times, and I mean, I'm mainly in the Agile space. This thing is called Agile Inside Conversations. You're mainly in the product community. I believe ultimately it's the same thing, but not everyone looks at it this way. A lot of people in that space believe that you can't, and maybe even you shouldn't, have a strategy because that would be too far into the future and we cannot predict the future. I believe otherwise. How do you look at that? Especially given your subtitle about roadmaps and all of that, which again goes into some kind of longer term planning.
Absolutely. So yeah, we started with this because why we need direction. We need direction because if not, teams are working towards optimizing too many different things that at the end is a little bit of improvement in each direction. And to be honest, I mean, I have been there. I have been when I started my career, certainly within Hyperloop strategy, and I was working in one of those teams, optimizing something that had very little impact. I can share some stories about that. But on the flip side, when you have a strategy, you are basically able to make that position that we just discussed. If you are not having a strategy, you are not deciding how to win, and someone else is figuring out how to win. And eventually you will optimize the shiny things that you will see here and there, but eventually you will have competitors that are out competing you for certain niches, for certain things that the customers value. So that's why I think it's super, super mega important to have a strategy. And eventually, at the end of the day, the efforts you are making build on top of each other when you have a strategy rather than going in opposite directions.
Yeah. I fully agree. And I think one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have is that agility or innovation is all about reacting. So you see that something happens and then you have to react.
Yeah.
If I look at the best companies, if I look at the best products, if I look at the best entrepreneurs, none of them have been reacting. They understand that there are certain trends. I mean, there's this great story of Jeff Bezos looking at the growth of the internet, but then making a decision. Okay, I'm going to build something that's going to benefit from that growth, whether it's 2 years down the road or 10 years down the road. That's where the long-term thinking comes in. I don't know, but I know that this growth can result in many new business opportunities. And then this gives them direction. It didn't tell them we're going to go into this category and this category and this category. Initially, it was just books, but you need to make decisions. And decisions, I always tell to the teams that I work with, if a decision is completely based on data, you don't need a decision. Right? Yeah, decisions are always taken in uncertainty.
Yeah.
They can be data informed, trend informed, but decisions always mean you're positioning yourself. And the more consistent you're positioning yourself, doesn't matter how many years into the future, I think the better your outcomes can be, right? And
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe going back to that, I think that the way I frame it is not that agility is kind of taking any shiny object you see out there. It's like you think big, but start small and learn. Because also can happen that your strategy is completely wrong. I mean, this is what you're saying. You're making a hypothesis, you're making a bet for the future, and you may be wrong. So you want to start small, learn, and see if you need to pivot. But that doesn't mean that you don't have, you don't build this hypothesis.
Exactly. You still should have that longer term plan. Now, we talked about the insights phase, about the selection phase, which is ultimately about positioning yourself in that field. What are the steps after that you usually run? And I guess you also do this in a coaching role with many of these organizations to find their product direction and then move from there into more informed discovery and delivery.
Absolutely, yeah. So the thing that these two phases about collecting the insights and making the selection is so the hardest one, so that hard strategy. Then the other thing we need to do is to put goals and assumptions, which is exactly what we discussed. You need to make your hypothesis. So say, hey, I have this insight that this might be a good opportunity. There is some data backing it, but also we are making an assumption of the future. We select that this is a good opportunity, given the position we want to create. Then we need to see how we will measure success. So we say, hey, given what we know, our hypothesis is that this is how big this can get, and these are the risks that we face. And this risk part is, of course, is part of the hypothesis at the end of the day, but it's quite important because, as you said, this is what will fit into discovery afterwards. If you, as a leader, say, hey, these are the assumptions, imagine a team that may not be part of the decision. If you are being very clear and transparent on, hey, this is why I believe this is going to be big or this big, then they can act on that and they can do the discovery to prove this is right or wrong. So that's the third phase, kind of making this hypothesis and coming up with a measure of success. And the final one is what I call synthesis, which is you need to make sure that the strategy is actionable. So usually having this 50-page document is useful for all the process we discussed in the previous parts, but now you need to be able to communicate it, and the way I frame it is repeat it in 3 minutes in every OKR presentation or any all hands or whatever. So you need to have a very clear synthesis that people who probably heard more about it can actually keep fresh in their minds and connect back to the whole thing. So I usually use this the pillars model, saying, hey, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is what the measure of success, and this is why it's important. So very, very simple diagram expressing the strategy in one chart.
Yeah. Now, Nacho, initially you mentioned this is addressed to product leaders, right? Now, when we get into after beyond stage like phase one, insights, and then the selection phase, get into the assumptions, the mapping, the synthesis ultimately, my guess is it is some kind of a handover, right? And quote unquote, from the product lead to the product managers. To what extent would you recommend to your product leaders to involve the product managers in the insights and the selection phase?
Yeah. So maybe answering more broadly your question, I have an article about it. I call it the bottom up versus top down tension. And
Mhm.
actually, I have diagrammed it this way. You have a triangle going down, which is around your strategic work towards more execution, and the one from more execution to strategic. And the influence from the team is greater, of course, on the OKRs such execution, and gets thinner through strategy. And of course, for leaders, it's the opposite. So no one is not involved in any of those. So, for example, as a product leader, you want the OKRs to be mostly team-based because they have the more concrete insights and they know how much they can move the levers, and they're more committed if they've created it. But you need to have a say on that because you need to kind of direct them and get them with context. On the strategy, I would say maybe it's the opposite. So you want to be informed, especially on the insights coming from the teams. So you want to involve, especially your more senior people, or for example, if you have different products, there might be products that are in early stages or that need to grow a bit more. So you want to collect the insights there. So you want to involve this in this way. And then on the selection phase, you are more on the kind of consulting them. So you're more deciding and seeing with them, hey, how does this feel? And trying to make sure that they are committed to it and they are kind of behind it in a way. And also, by the way, the same is true for other stakeholders because we're talking about the product team, but the product leader is not creating the strategy in isolation. You need to work with your marketing peers, you need to work with your sales, your operations, whoever in the organization, and your strategy needs to consider their concerns and they need to buy in your strategy. So the sooner you involve them, the better the outcome of this alignment is.
Yeah, probably also the technology lead, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. By the way, that's an important point because I usually say that the leadership trio is responsible for this direction. Usually, the product lead has a stronger need on, as for example, let's use sales as an example. Say, hey, we are all you will need to contribute on the architecture of the system because we need to ensure growth for the future. But the tech lead or the tech manager, whoever it is, should have a higher responsibility. On a strategy is the opposite. So product leader probably has more responsibility, but he needs to have the buy-in and a close collaboration with design and tech.
Yeah, it's usually that product trio, right? Design, tech,
Exactly. It's a kind of the
and
scale product
product.
trios.
And product. So you mentioned your podcast and also the article top down and bottom up. We will make sure that we link both of them to the episode when we post it on YouTube and onto our website, so that people that are curious about it can easier find those things. Now, Nacho, when we talk about this product direction, you move from there, and we talked about it. It's not sequential, but still, right? By sequential, we don't mean that product direction is done once you hand it over to discovery, and discovery is not done once you hand it over to delivery, right? They're still going on. Now, in which cycles do you recommend to product leaders or that trio to really revisit the direction that they have provided and maybe even co-created with the teams? And based on which insights would you recommend a higher frequency in that refinement or in that review?
That's a great point. So first of all, depending on the maturity of, I was going to say the company, but it's not the company, it's actually the product. So the maturity of the product, because it can be a very new product in an older company. Depending on the maturity of the product, you can set longer or shorter cycles. So the newer the product, the shorter the strategy cycle. Starting on, hey, I don't have product market fit. Probably you are just iterating to get product market fit. Once you get product market fit, you might probably can do a 6 months growth stage. And if you are very kind of consolidated product, you can aim for like 18 months or something like that. So that's from the strategy perspective. There is a very natural cycle, which is the quarterly cycle, especially if you're doing OKRs, or I mean, not necessarily OKRs, but any sort of short-term objectives. That's a natural cycle to say, hey, are we hitting our OKRs? Yes or no? What does that mean, or what do we learn that should impact our roadmap and our strategy? And one thing that you mentioned I didn't say is that usually strategy is never done not because you are changing all the time, but because you are refining it all the time. So you are making it a bit more kind of clear, or the positioning or the results you have, you incorporate them. So it's a refining process. So this quarterly cycle is very natural to do so. And the final thing, I actually put this in the book as well. I have kind of several feedback loops, especially if you're putting out a new strategy. So, for example, you can have internal surveys to different groups when you do the communication of the strategy. Then you will have teams that are doing discovery on the topics of your strategy that you can have results as early as 1 month or whatever, depending on the cycle and the speed you have in discovery. This can vary, but 1 month can be a good result. And then the quarterly cycle is the one that kind of can carry over for longer.
Yeah. No, I think that quarterly cycle, no matter whether you're using OKRs or not, is a quite good one, because especially if you're looking at directional decisions, you wouldn't make them ad hoc. You need to have this really needs to be informed not necessarily by a huge amount of data, but maybe even a huge amount of anecdotes, right? You have to have had some conversations with customers. You have to have to see where does it work, where does it lack to work, etc. You mentioned the term product market fit, and I fully agree, right? This is one of the first things that we need to make sure, like problem solution fit, then product market fit. There are products where you get to product market fit, which is building products that customers love, but don't work for the business. And Marty always says, and I love this, right? You need to build products that customers love and work for the business. So where do you put this and work for the business in the creation of product direction and everything that we just talked about?
That's a good question, because I think that I think that this is changing, but if you look at the past, yeah, what was that we have a lot of free money available for some years, and that created these startups that are more focused on kind of user-based growth than the monetization. We can discuss if it was possible or not possible. That's not what I'm trying to get into. But at the end of the day, they always have a business hypothesis behind it. So let's use Twitter as an ugly example, a very old one, so we don't get into trouble. But they always had this: hey, we can monetize this audience through it can be should be a subscription, should be advertising machine. So this sort of hypotheses have always been there. So what I try to coach teams to do is to try to validate both sides of the hypothesis. So it's okay if you are prioritizing one, say, hey, we need to first find if there will be a user, because if there is no user, there will not be any advertisement. But as soon as you have the user, you need to test the advertising hypothesis. Even though it's an hypothesis and the business model is not fully fledged, you still need to validate that the hypothesis is true. So I think that's the way I actually, to be honest, I wouldn't call that there is product market fit until the product is working for the business. Again, that's maybe controversial with the past experiences with the startups growing a lot. But the way I see it is that, as you said, a product is a product when it works for the user and the business.
And I mean, to add to your point, yes, I think in startups that was very common. And now the ship is turning and they need to become profitable, or at least show a path to profitability. But I've also seen this in larger organizations where they have an innovation department, which, because of the funding that they get, very similar to startups that get cheap money, is not at all focused on making it work for the business, but is just thinking about the product market fit. So including that into product market fit, I think is an excellent idea, but it needs to be obvious to everyone out there. Now, out of curiosity, whose job is that in your world? Is it the product manager? Is it the product lead? Is it out of nowhere?
You mentioned about finding product market fit, or which job?
Making it work for the business, and in our definition now, part of product market fit.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it's so. Let's imagine this is a new team working on a new product, hopefully small enough so you don't scale before you find the product market fit. So usually there is one product hat. You can call it product manager, product lead. It's the same because I mean probably it's irrelevant because they are mostly executing because at this stage you are not doing kind of super big strategy decisions. As we said, until you have product market fit, it's hard to plan for 6 months. But when you are in this stage, you are making very bold decisions as well. So can have the figure of product lead, but at the end of the day, it's a very execution role. So that's my take.
Yeah, no, I like that. For me, it's always like similar to a startup CEO. You don't even consider
Exactly.
you
Thanks.
don't even consider yourself as some kind of a CEO because you're so deep into the trenches, rightfully so, until you make the product work and the company work, and then maybe you hire a few other people, and but until then, you're very deep into the trenches.
Exactly.
So we've looked at this whole concept of product direction, product discovery, product delivery, how they then again inform each other. You mentioned the 3 months OKR cycle, or even if you don't use OKRs, that quarterly cycle is good for making refinement decisions. Now, when you see, before I ask this question, another question, we talked about what do you start with? And that immediately went into like the actionable work that you do with a product leader. But getting a company to wanting to do this, right? So that shift in mindset, that's a different beast. Is that something where you also engage? Or are you someone that is usually like brought in after all of that is settled and the organization knows, all right, we need a good product operating model, as Marty describes it, and you basically help them build that model and especially teach the skills to do the direction, discovery, and delivery piece?
It's a good question. I think that the way I see it is that if the leaders of the organization, even the product leader or some higher up leadership, did not realize that they need to change, it's very hard that they will hire anyone to help them change. So the way I see it is that they need to have some awareness. Maybe the awareness is different. Maybe they don't know that they want a product-led operating model. Maybe it's that they are seeing that, for example, most of their initiatives are failing, or for example, on the Agile world, they are stuck and they are not delivering anything. So that's where they start bringing people, and that's I would say that my role mostly in this early stage is kind of trying to show them the product operating model and how it can be different and the results it can get, so they can say, okay, this is the model we need to opt in for.
Yeah. Now you're giving me an excellent segue because that was the question I actually wanted to ask before this one. It's the results, right? Any business is interested in results. And I attended, you and I were talking about this before. I attended Marty Kagan's Transformed workshop a few months ago. It was in July, so almost a month and a half ago. And he spends a lot of time, which I believe is worth it, on what will be different after you've transformed. Can you share a few of those stories that you've experienced, maybe throughout the time when you were still part of an organization, but also afterwards, after you started coaching organizations, where did you realize, hey, we've successfully made that transition? We are now able to do things that we were not able to do before, and what those things were.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that goes back to what I was saying before, that companies are at different maturity levels, but I can talk about different examples and this may help. At the end of the day, it all boils down to they are doing work on let's put it on software, because most of these companies are coming from what Martin calls the traditional IT model. So they are coming from investing in a software team that is not delivering the results they expect. That's the kind of the underlying situation. So the problem with that in measuring results is that they usually don't have a good baseline to compare it with, because they are not even, some of these companies are not even measuring these results. So they are saying, hey, we will invest this money and we said this is what we want to build, and the business guys say, hey, please build X. They build X and they are not sure what the result was and they are not sure what we're expecting from it. So that's already a problem. So the way I see the benefits is that, first of all, is starting to understand that value. So for the first layer for me of this operating model, the first maturity level is that you have a hypothesis for anything that you're building, and when you deliver it, you can measure the result it has. So this is the very first basic stage. I think it comes from kind of the very basic of delivery and measuring and being able to optimize what you deliver. The second stage is that most of the time, 70% of the things we build fail. And there are kind of, I have an article on this, but there are many companies that publish this very openly on how many ideas don't make any business impact. So this is where the discovery comes into place. So what I told them is that what you will be able to see is that you have a pipeline that was never visible before, because you will say, hey, this enters the pipelines and this gets built. We will put a layer in front of that saying, what enters the pipeline, we will do an assessment, we will do experimentation, and we will discover things that are not valuable. So you don't waste money on building those. So that's the second piece.
Absolutely.
And the third,
one thing to add. I mean, one of the
it.
quotes that always helps me here is, every feature is just a potential solution. We don't know yet whether it will be a solution until we have, maybe there are some ways to experiment it up front, but at the latest when we built it, we have to test whether it is solving the problem that we intended to solve. So every feature is a potential solution. Sorry, continue, please.
No, that's perfect. And the third layer is what we discussed about the positioning. So this is the hardest to actually measure, because there are no ways to compare the results of having direction versus not having direction, because say you're making progress in different places, but you cannot compare because they don't have a direction to start with. So when you're having a direction, the take it is that you will have all teams working on the thing you want to, the thing that you want the most, versus teams focusing on many different areas. And this is especially true for large organizations. So this is something that you will not tell a startup founder. But if you stack these three resources, visualize everything that you're building, the result you're having, discard the things that will add value, and focus on the right things. This is super powerful. And this is, to me, the value of these 3Ds of the operation model: direction, discovery, and delivery.
Yeah. Now, this also connects, and we were talking about this earlier, to what Marty Kagan now is mentioning. And he's going to bring it up in his new book coming next year in March or something like that, Transformed. He talks about how to build, which is basically delivery, right? You need to become better at how to build stuff, and continuous delivery, all of that is part of that. How to solve problems, which is discovery. And ultimately, this is then the direction piece, how to decide which problems to solve. And I think if you manage to do all of that, right, and create clarity for everyone around these three steps, plus then direction in terms of, okay, these are the problems that we're focusing on. Could be problems of a certain customer group or a shared problem across multiple customer groups, etc. You allow the product managers, the product owners, so much better to focus their capacity, their energy, their passion on the stuff that actually is going to then advance the organization. And doing that means you have to make decisions as a product leader, which is
that's a very good point, because I see so many product leaders, because they are kind of calling saying, hey, I want more empowered teams. I say, hey, it's your fault, because you are not giving them the context of empower. It's very easy to say, hey, you need to be empowered, you need to decide what to build, and they have no idea, because they don't know what problems you want to solve. So you need to provide it clarity. And this is kind of the mismatch between, hey, we want them to be empowered, but they are not doing anything. It's because you are not giving clarity on what you are expecting from them. So I think that the direction part is a cornerstone of empowerment.
Yeah, the direction part definitely is a cornerstone. The other part is that you teach the competencies, which then goes into the book that Petra wrote, right?
Exactly.
All of these things, first and foremost, enable the teams to be able to take decisions, and then you give them the authority, which is the empowerment, to take those decisions. And without the first elements, the direction, the competencies, give them all the power. They won't know what to do with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Nacho, this was an excellent conversation. I learned a lot. I like the trilogy that you have of direction, discovery, and delivery. I think there's a lot of potential out there because looking at the organizations that I've worked with, this is really one of the big problems. What is the role of leadership in the future, be it product leadership, technical leadership, etc.? I think the concepts that you and I discussed can be used outside of the product domain. So not only outside of software, but also completely outside of the product domain for other areas. Obviously, a few adjustments that need to be made. And I'm very much looking forward to reading your book. I mentioned to you earlier, I haven't read it yet. It's on my list. I'm going to get it. And the next
I hope I
time
convince you.
yeah. And the next time we see each other, you're going to sign that copy for me.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right, Nacho, thank you so much for stopping by and sharing your insights with me and our community.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.